Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. We are going to be discussing the whitewashing, of Dr. Martin Luther King's legacy. Stay tuned right after this. Hello, everyone. My name is Attorney Chloe Corbett, also known as the Duchess of Justice, and with me I have,
The Minister of Justice, Attorney Augustus Corbett.
and we are the Defiant Lawyers. We provide legal analysis of trending politics, policies, personalities, and pop culture to empower each and every one of you all to defy this unjust legal system. Once again, thank you so much for joining this broadcast today. Happy Saturday to you all. Hope you're doing well too, Dad.
I am doing fabulous, Chloe. I'm really excited about today's topic. Next to Easter, Christmas, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s holiday, birthday celebration, birthday weekend is the highlight of my month, of my year, actually. And so his birthday celebration, then followed by Black History Month, and of course, Juneteenth are big on our calendar. So I'm so excited to talk about him today from a very different perspective than you're going to hear about Dr. King. So I am fired up about this conversation today.
I am too. And we entitled today's discussion as The Radical and Woke Dr. King, who white conservatives or white America and black conservatives rather deny. And we named it that way for a reason. Now, everyone who's grown up in America, we've learned about Dr. Martin Luther King. His birthday is now a national holiday. We have read and heard about the I Have a Dream speech, but there's a part of Dr. King that white America and black conservatives want you all to forget. And the purpose of today's analysis is to dig deep into what Dr. King thought about other issues of his time that still affect us today. And he was a revolutionary. And we're going to prove that with the clips and the speeches that we analyze today. So I'm so excited to get into this, Dad, because there was a lot more to Reverend Dr. King um, than just his I Have a Dream speech. And towards the end of his life, he began to dig into issues that are still affecting Black Americans and Americans as a whole, even to this day. So I'm ready to get into it for that reason as well.
Yeah, with the I Have a Dream speech, even that speech is mischaracterized.
Yeah.
And white America tends to focus just on that part of the speech where Dr. King said, I don't want my four children to be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And white America has used that very small snippet of that speech to redefine King, to make King sort of a passive person, um, and have used that part of the speech to propagate this color blindness doctrine. And that was not Dr. King's intent. In fact, if you look at or listen to the entire speech, he was really from his, the things he said in the speech, Chloe, he was really making an argument for reparations
Hmm.
because the part that you never seldom hear is where he was talking about how America wrote the African American people. He used the word Negro. That was the common word. You're going to hear that word a lot today coming from Dr. King. That was parlance in that day. We don't refer to ourselves as Negroes anymore. But he basically said the America had written a check to the African American that bounced. And essentially, he was saying, we have come to collect on that check. And when he talks about a check that America wrote, he was referring to all the the documents, the Declaration of Independence, um, certain parts of the U.S. Constitution, the amendments to the Constitution, 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments. He was talking about those promises that were embedded in what America's all about, but those things had not resulted in equality for African Americans. So it was like a bounce check. And so he was coming to say, we're ready to collect. We did all this work for 250 years in slavery. You then promised us 40 acres and a mule. We never got any of that. So went through 100 years of Jim Crow, etc. We're going to talk about that later. So we're here to collect today. We're here to collect. That's pretty radical, Chloe. That's
Uh,
that's um that's woke. That's woke right there. And but they limit that speech to when he simply said, I don't want my children to be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And yeah, that's a great part of the speech. But it's been mischaracterized. And basically, what he was saying is stop treating us inferior because of our skin color. But they take it and they've taken it and twisted it like they have done the word woke, like they're in the process. All you hear now is woke, woke this, woke that, woke this, woke that, coming out of white conservatives and black conservatives. And also the phrase critical race theory. They take those words that we've used for years and decades, and completely redefine them and make them bad words. So we are not going to let them do that to Dr. King. Dr. King was radical, he was woke, and he was a critical race theorist.
I'm radical, I'm woke, and I'm a critical race theorist as well. And I've been
Ditto,
woke.
ditto, ditto.
And I've been that way since before it was bastardized by white America and black conservatives. The term woke, and referring to the "I Have a Dream" speech, that Dr. King started that speech by saying that 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, that the Negro still is not free, and that black people were still crippled by, in his words, the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination.
Ah,
So you can't then, whitewash Dr. King's legacy by just focusing on what he said about his four children without first acknowledging that the major point of that speech, just like you said, one is that we're coming to cast this check, and two, that black Americans were not free, and we deserve and we're demanding that we be free from the manacles of segregation.
yes.
And that speech in 1963, it led him down the path of speeches that we're going to go through that really show why he was radical and why he was woke.
Yeah, you can't listen to these speeches, read his books, and deny. You can't legitimately deny that he was a radical, that he was woke, that he was a critical race theorist. He was nonviolent, okay? He was certainly nonviolent. So he didn't advocate violence, but he was definitely radical. He was definitely woke, and he was definitely a critical race theorist, but they have watered him down. We want to reclaim Dr. King's legacy. And I think we're doing it. I think what we're doing here is consistent with um, Dr. Bernice King, his daughter, his baby child. I think she too, I've seen things that she has said and heard speeches and talks that she's given, Chloe. She doesn't like it either when white America takes her father's speeches and words, or snippets of them, and misuse them for their purposes.
Yeah, we know, in terms of watering down Dr. King's legacy, if they do it to Christ in the Bible, um, we know that they're going to do it to civil rights leaders and other change leaders that followed in Christ's footsteps in terms of speaking out against injustice and speaking up for the vulnerable. So that's why it's so important to speak out against it so that younger generations know that Dr. King would have stood with them, as millennials, as Gen Zers, and talking out against issues that affect everyday people.
I love that. I love what you just said. I think it's so critical. And that's one of the reasons why I love our show, because we give a perspective from my generation. I'm in the 60s. I was born in 62. I remember segregation. I remember sharecropping. I remember some of those things. And so I bring a certain perspective to these issues. You, on the other hand, early 30s, you are a millennial. You um, have a slightly, or in some cases, a very uh, grave difference in perspectives than I do. Um, so you get both here. And I love what you just said. I love what you just said. And that is tying Dr. King's legacy to issues that African American youth today um, face. You know, I don't know the age groups, but Gen Xers, Gen Y, Gen Z, and I love that. I love that. This is not, Dr. King is not a relic of the past.
No.
And the things that he gave his life fighting for, much of it, a lot of it has not been materialized, even still to this day. So, yeah, I really appreciate you connecting his legacy with the youth.
Yeah, because I mean, when you go back and read his speeches and listen to his speeches, everything that he talked about is still applicable to today. When he speaks out against poverty, war, economic injustice, racial injustice, militarism, American imperialism, and so many other issues, the exact same thing can be applied to 2023 now. So that's why I am so passionate too about revealing this other side of Dr. King, so that millennials and Gen Z and Gen Yers, we can relate to him, because he's not just some figure in the past that you learned about in school, about that I have a dream speech. He talked about issues that still affect us to this day, every day.
Now, I think this is an excellent place to pull up a slide that I prepared to show why Dr. King's legacy is applicable today, why it's relevant today. Because, Chloe, a lot of African Americans, not, a lot, believe that, you know, we won this fight. This
Mhm.
fight is over. What are y'all talking about? I'm doing well. Um, Fortunately, from data that we have here, most African Americans still know that racism is a serious problem. But a growing number have stepped away from Dr. King's dream. Black Americans have stepped away from his, what he would call fierce urgency of now, I think was the way he put it. I could have just messed that up. But anyway, I want to bring up a slide and try to explain why this is really still important in 2023. Okay?
Let's do it.
All right. This slide here is an iceberg. That's what I tried to make here. You see the crystal clear water of the ocean, and then you see the sky above it, and you see the black. We know ice is typically not black, but this is black ice. What about that? I had a friend. I had a friend in college named Black Ice from D.C. So this is black ice. Black ice is representative of Black Americans. So obviously, when we got to America, we spent 250 years here. We came over here in slave ships. We spent 250 years in chattel slavery, which, trying to describe the horrors of chattel slavery it would take much more than the time that we have here. Just know that the half has not been told about what our forefathers endured during chattel slavery and the impact that it still has on our community to this day. Well, after 2.5 centuries, 2.5 centuries, 2.5 centuries, 2.5 centuries, did I say 2.5 centuries? Oh, by the way, did I say 2.5 centuries? 250 years, not 10 years, not 5 years, not 50 years, not 75 years, 250 years.
Mm.
African Americans were chattel property under the law. The law defined us that way.
And that type of slavery was different from other societies in the past, because I've heard people compare, well, there's always been slavery in different cultures and different countries, but chattel slavery is different because enslaved Africans who were brought over here were seen as property,
That's
and
right.
they were bought and sold as such.
That's
So
right.
it's different from forced labor, from unpaid labor. It is under the law, enslaved Africans were property and could be sold and bought. That is the main difference between other types of slavery that different cultures and countries have had throughout the centuries.
Well, another big difference is I've had some white evangelicals say to me that slavery is in the Bible, and it is. God's the Lord, Jesus's descendants were enslaved people. That for me creates sort of a kindred spirit in the natural, in the flesh, with the Lord. So He understands what it is for us to have descended from slavery. But in the Bible, yes, there was slavery, but guess what? There was a profound difference. Number one, as you pointed out, it wasn't chattel slavery. And number two, it was not for perpetuity. It was not permanent. God had a specific rule in the Old Testament that any enslaved person could not be enslaved longer than 7 years. Whereas the American slave system, apart from the cruelty, the rape, the murder, the buck breaking, the the tireless working, the all of that, it was for perpetuity. If your mother was black, you were born into slavery automatically. Period. No questions. So they intended to keep people of African descent in slavery on and on. You know what? Had there not been a civil war, there still may be slavery in America to this day. Now, I know that sounds hyperbolic, but it's not. It's not, because a bloody war had to be fought to end it. That shows you how determined they were to keep African American people in bondage. But anyway, I digress for now. Chattel slavery lasted for 250 years. Well, we overcame it. 13th Amendment abolished it for the most part. And then we started the period of Reconstruction, which only lasted for about 10 years. And then the whole Jim Crow era began. Okay? And we got here, though slavery was abolished, blacks were still oppressed by Jim Crow laws. And this was the era that Dr. King was born in, and he addressed the Jim Crow laws. We're people of Christian faith, and we believe that it was God who led um, efforts against these sins against humanity, the sin of slavery, the sin of Jim Crow. And in each of those generations, God raised up a Frederick Douglass and even white abolitionists to fight against those evils. Dr. King, among many others, uh, God used to dismantle Jim Crow.
Mhm.
But the fight wasn't over, Chloe. That lasted 100 years. That lasted 100 years, almost exactly. Slavery ended officially in 1865, and Jim Crow lasted until 1965. That's in my lifetime. I was born in 62. Okay? So Jim Crow, with all of its hideous measures and laws and customs that basically relegated African American people to a form of slavery without calling it slavery. And then there was the passage of the 13th, 14th, of the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act, and they made a difference. And African Americans begin to come out of that Jim Crow era. And here's the point I want to make. A lot of African Americans think because we were able to dismantle segregation and were able to integrate and go and live in white America's neighborhoods and attend their schools and shop in their stores and swim in their pools and sleep in their hotels and eat in their restaurants, we have arrived. We have arrived. We have arrived. No, 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 no. Because the end of Jim Crow initiated a third phase, systemic racism. Let me bring this back up. Systemic racism. And that is where the systems of America have policies and practices that continue to deprive African Americans of full citizenship and full equality. So just because African Americans are able to live in white neighborhoods and buy homes and so on, don't think for a minute we have full equality. And don't think for a minute that certain elements of white society wouldn't take the progress from us that we have earned and fought for and died, gave our lives for. Chloe, what I'd like to do right now quickly to prove this point is I want to pull up a most recent case of housing discrimination to prove systemic racism is not a relic of the past. It is still very present. Just recently, I'm going to pull my iPad up. Just recently, what is the date of this? January 12th, 2023, the Department of Justice secured a $31 million judgment against a bank called the City National Bank because it was engaged in a practice called redlining. And that is where banks used to literally draw red lines around black neighborhoods and would not lend those black American citizens in those neighborhoods money to own homes, to buy property. This is January 12th, 2023. This is very much, absolutely a part of our life to this day. And Attorney General Merrick Garland, he launched an effort in October of 2021, something called the Combating Redlining Initiative. Now, let me say right there, Chloe, and I don't mean to take up too much time. I just want to make this point. Mm-hmm. Let me say right there that this shows you the power of voting. Because had the GOP won the presidency, had Donald Trump been reelected, there would be no Merrick Garland who would have initiated a combating redlining initiative. The attorney general that Trump would have appointed in his reelection would not be interested in trying to stop redlining. So because we got out and voted and got Biden in, and he put Merrick Garland in the DOJ's office, he started this initiative. And so he has taken a bite out of this bank's wallet because of their discriminatory behavior. I just want to read a little bit here of what he said when he announced this settlement. It's about the fourth paragraph. It says, in the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the issue of fair housing is a moral issue. Thus, ending redlining is a critical step to closing the widening gaps in home ownership and wealth, especially in a city as large and diverse as Los Angeles, said U.S. Attorney Martin Estrada for the Central District of California. It is unacceptable that redlining persists into the 21st century, and this case demonstrates our commitment to combat redlining and hold banks and others accountable when they engage in unlawful discrimination. Through this agreement, we are taking a major step forward by removing unlawful and discriminatory barriers in residential mortgage lending and meeting the credit needs in Los Angeles. There's one other thing I want to show you. Go back to the very top paragraph. The very first paragraph, it says, the Justice Department announced today an agreement to resolve allegations that City National Bank, City National, engaged in a, underline this, pattern or practice of lending discrimination. That, those words, a pattern or practice, that basically means that they were practicing systemic racism. This bank had a pattern and practices in place that their employees had to follow, even if their employees didn't want to follow those practices and patterns. They had to, because that's how systemic racism works. The systems have policies, practices in place that brings about the disparate treatment of African Americans. So I went through all of that to show you, yes, we abolished slavery, we dismantled Jim Crow laws, but we still deal with systemic racism. And that's where we are now. That's the fight that we're having now. And once we can deal with the systems of oppression in this country, then we can get to the tip of this iceberg and have full equality. So this fight is not over. That's my point. This fight is not over. Sorry for taking so long, Chloe.
Yeah, it's not over at all. And we must take back the meaning of what the term woke means and speak out against this systemic racism and take our own power into our own hands as a community. Dr. King gave a speech called The Three Evils of um, Society, in which he named racism, militarism, and poverty as the three evils of society. And in that speech, he talked about how I want to read it, so let me pull it up. He said we must further recognize that the ghetto is a domestic colony. Black people must develop.
Wow,
Yeah,
wow, wow.
yeah,
That sounds pretty woke to me.
that's woke. That's woke. So basically, what he's saying is that the American government has colonized the ghetto, so poor folks.
Wait a minute. I thought, and we have been told, that the ghetto exists because of lazy, shiftless, black people who don't want to work, who are having babies all over everywhere, just trifling, no good people. That's what create ghettos, not the government. What you're espousing, that the government, created ghettos as colonies, that is woke ideology.
It's woke and it's true. It's the
It's very
truth.
true.
You just detailed the pattern and practice that lenders have used to redline African Americans from buying homes and having home ownership. So that's why when we say Reverend Dr. King was woke and radical, he was. He said we must further recognize that the ghetto is a domestic colony. I mean, that says it all.
Wow.
And then he says Black people must develop programs that will aid in the transfer of power and wealth into the hands of residents of the ghetto. So he's talking about a transference of power. What does that sound like? It's redistributing
Please,
economic
Chloe,
power.
please go back and read that again. Please.
So he says we must further recognize that the ghetto is a domestic colony,
Mm.
and Black people must develop programs that will aid in the transfer of power and wealth into the hands of residents of the ghetto.
Wow. Chloe. 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 Did he say that?
He said that.
Dr. King.
Dr. King.
That's
I have a dream,
radical.
Dr. King.
That's radical. That is radical. You sure that wasn't Malcolm X?
No. MLK.
You sure that wasn't Stokely Carmichael?
Not at all.
Was that Huey Newton?
No.
Fred Hampton of the founder of the Black Panther Party?
Nope. It wasn't Farrakhan. It was MLK. And he called that the new politics, Dad. He called that that must be the new politics.
That wealth transfer.
Yes. Yes. In the same speech that he said, we must also realize that the problems of racial injustice and economic injustice cannot be solved without a radical redistribution of political and economic power.
Whew.
That was Dr. King. That's the Dr. King that we celebrate and that we wanted
Whew.
to highlight for everyone, that he was woke and he advocated for a redistribution of American society, because the fabric of this nation needs to change in order for us to truly reach that top tier of the iceberg that my dad wrote for full equity and full equality.
So that sounded too like an argument for reparations.
Yeah.
That's what that is.
Yeah.
Dr. King believed in reparations.
Reparations.
So then how is it that he is basically defined as this, the content? I don't want my children judged by the content, by the color of their skin, but by the content of the. What you just read is pretty radical. I mean, it is through the roof radical. I don't know if you remember, Barack Obama said something similar to that on the campaign trail when he was first running for office. And a white plumber challenged him, Joe the plumber. Do you remember Joe the plumber?
I
Plumber?
don't remember him.
Joe the plumber was a plumber who challenged him because Joe the plumber said, "You're basically talking about taking wealth from white people and giving it to black people." And for that, they characterize Obama as Marxist. Okay? They characterize him as Marxist. King said that 50 years earlier. And that was real, again, that was the real purpose of the I Have a Dream speech. We come to cash our check. I mean, we come to cash our check.
And we were promised it 100 years before that. That's what 40 acres and a mule is. It was taken under Sherman's order. It was taking the property of white plantation owners and giving it to black people as well as a mule so that we can start our own communities and our own businesses. That was what was promised to us in Reconstruction after the end of the Civil War and after the end of slavery. And that's the check that we've never been able to cash.
Wow.
So honestly, and I mean, if you put into perspective that yes, King was radical and woke, but he was reiterating what was supposed to happen 100 years before him.
You on
That never
fire.
did.
You on fire, Chloe. You on fire, girl. So what I just heard you say is all Dr. King said was just do what y'all promised. Do what you have written in these highfalutin documents.
Yes.
Uh, Um, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal
Yep.
and are endued with certain inalienable rights by their creator. Among them are the pursuit of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Yep.
That's what you said. Live up to it. And here, all these many years later, we're still having to say, just live up to what you said. So that's all Dr. King, that's all he said. I wonder if Thomas Jefferson penned the Declaration of Independence. I wonder if he knew, and the signers to the Declaration of Independence, whether they knew that that document would become the basis for the cry for freedom. I wonder if they knew that.
Mm.
Well, that's a separate issue. That's for a whole nother day. Let me just shout out a couple of folks who have commented, friends and family members and loved ones. Uh, uh, Lorene, Sister Lorene, you remember Sister
Hey there.
Lorene, right?
Yeah.
She says, "I'm here. I love this. Always view your video, even after your live streaming when I cannot view it live." Thank you
Thank you for
so much,
joining.
Sister Lorene, for watching and being a part of the community. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Sister Ave says, white America just want to, and by the way, as you all can see, Sister Lorene is a white American, okay? And there is special history with Sister Lorene in our family. When I was pastoring a church back in North Carolina, Sister Lorene, and it was in North Carolina, a little small country town where I'm from, and a town that has a lot of bigotry, prejudice, and racism. Sister Lorraine joined our black church and became our our music minister. Played all our music, sung songs. She was our lead music person for several years. Um, and this again was in a small southern town in North Carolina. She broke a lot of barriers. just by doing that. I really want to say that our church was the first integrated church in that part of North Carolina. Um, I'm serious. The first one. Now integrated churches are throughout that area. So I had to shout her out because she did precisely what Dr. King advocated, right? Because it's tough for some whites to sit in a church that is pastored by a black man and full of black people. But she came, and she wasn't the only one. She wasn't the only white person who joined our church. We had a few. We had quite a few whites. Sometimes there was as many whites in our church as blacks. It was the Holy Spirit. It was the Holy Spirit. Sister Lorraine, thank you for that. I always thank you for that, because that was very, 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 very Kingus and Jesus-esque. So, Sister Ave, my dear Sister Ave, she says white Americans just want to minimize anyone or anything that wants to have the playing field of black and brown people. Amen. Sister A further says Dr. King was by no means passive.
Amen.
He just did not advocate violence. Exactly
Yep.
right. Exactly right. Thank you, Sister Ave, and many other comments are here. Yes. Okay, Chloe.
So, I mean, just like Sister Abe said, MLK was not passive. He did not advocate for violence, but he
Can
was a
can
revolutionary.
it would be remiss of me if I did not say that we're not talking, as has been demonstrated here in my comments today about Sister Lorraine, that all whites are racist. That is not what we're saying at all. Not at all. Mm-mm. Mm-mm.
Mm-mm.
I go all the way back to slavery. A lot of the abolitionists were whites. Thaddeus Stevens, John Brown, many others. Jonathan Edwards, the preacher, the senior, many. If it wasn't for them, um, the slavery would have never been abolished. So that is not what we're saying. Don't ever take that from anything that we have to say. We go hard for racial justice. We go hard for biblical justice, but that is not born out of a hatred for whites at all. It is born out of a hatred for white supremacy, because that's sin, that's demonic, that's not of God. But even real, true, Jesus loving white people also abhor white supremacy. And so, yes, Sister Lorraine is just one of many, 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 many examples. And Chloe, one of the things that I love during the George Floyd protests, a lot of those protesters were white.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of them. Sometimes most of them were white. So this is not about black people versus white people. This is about racial injustice and white supremacy. All right, go ahead. I won't interrupt you again.
Of America. And in another one of Dr. King's famous speech called The Other America, he outlines how there are literally two Americas. How there and let me read it for everyone, a brief portion of it. He said, "One America is beautiful for situation, and in a sense, this America is overflowing with the milk of prosperity and the honey of opportunity. This America is the habitat of millions of people who have food and material necessities for their bodies, and culture and education for their minds, and freedom and human dignity for their spirits. In this America, millions of people experience every day the opportunity of having life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." We all know where that comes from, in all of their dimensions. But tragically and unfortunately, there is another America. This other America has a daily ugliness about it that constantly transforms the ebulliency of hope into the fatigue of despair. In this America, millions of work starved men walk the streets daily and search for jobs that do not exist. In this America, millions of people find themselves living in rat infested, vermin filled slums. In this America, people are poor by the millions. That's what we're
Wow.
talking about.
Wow.
The
Wow.
divide that's always happened in this country. Whether it be white slave plantation owners and enslaved Africans, um, black ghettos, rich white CEOs, how the majority of our presidents have been white until 2008, and other issues. So, again, Dr. King was a revolutionary and he was radical.
Now, when you talk about the other America, Chloe, I think this is a beautiful time to play an excerpt of an interview that he did with an NBC correspondent. Is this a
Yes,
good time to do that?
I think it's a perfect time.
Okay. All right. Let's go to that.
What is it about the Negro? I mean, every other group that came as an immigrant somehow, not easily, but somehow got around it. Is it just the fact that Negroes are black?
That's a part of it, and that grows out of something else. You can't thingify anything without depersonalizing that something. If you use something as a means to an end, at that moment you make it a thing and you depersonalize it. The fact is that the Negro was a slave in this country for 244 years. That was a willful thing that was done. The Negro was brought here in chains, treated in very inhuman fashion, and this led to the thingification of the Negro. So he was not looked upon as a person. He was not looked upon as a human being with the same status and worth as other human beings. And the other thing is that human beings cannot continue to do wrong without eventually rationalizing that wrong. So
That thingification phrase
Mm.
that he uses is so powerful. Where he says basically, as we said in the opener, that Black Americans were chattel property, not people, property, things. And so he says there's no way that you can thingify something or someone and not devalue it and reduce it to an object that is useful only for your purposes. Okay.
Or
Um,
reduce it to a stereotype. That's one of the biggest things that infuriates me about racism is being looked at and being seen only as black first or only as some stereotype and not just a human being who has emotions and feelings just like anyone else. I experience it every day, almost stepping into a courtroom and being assumed as something else other than I'm not, or even just as a black woman having a bad day. That can be seen as, oh, she's the angry black woman or some other stereotype. And it's just the otherism and the thingification that Dr. King is talking about that really irks me.
all right, let's go back to that excerpt. And he gets even deeper into what you were talking about, this other America.
What is it about the Negro? I mean, every other group that came.
that grows out of something else. You can't thingify anything without depersonalizing that something. That was a willful thing that was done. The Negro was brought here in chains, treated in very inhuman fashion, and this led to the thingification of the Negro. So he was not looked upon as a person. He was not looked upon as a human being with the same status and worth as other human beings. And the other thing is that human beings cannot continue to do wrong without eventually rationalizing that wrong. So slavery was justified morally, biologically, theoretically, scientifically, everything else. And it seems to me that white America must see that no other ethnic group has been a slave on American soil. That is one thing that other immigrant groups haven't had to face. The other thing is that the color became a stigma. American society made the Negro's color a stigma, and that can never be overlooked. So I think these things are absolutely necessary. The other thing is that America freed the slaves in 1863 through the Emancipation Proclamation of Abraham Lincoln, but gave the slaves no land or nothing in reality, and as a matter of fact, to get started on. At the same time, America was giving away millions of acres of land in the West and the Midwest, which meant that there was a willingness to give the white peasants from Europe an economic base. And yet it refused to give its black peasants from Africa, who came here involuntarily in chains and had worked free for 244 years, any kind of economic base. And so emancipation for the Negro was really freedom to hunger. It was freedom to the winds and rains of heaven. It was freedom without food to eat or land to cultivate, and therefore it was freedom and famine at the same time. And when white Americans tell the Negro to lift himself by his own bootstraps, they don't look over the legacy of slavery and segregation. I believe we ought to do all we can and seek to lift ourselves by our own bootstraps, but it's a cruel jest to say to a bootless man that he ought to lift himself by his own bootstraps. And many Negroes, by the thousands and millions, have been left bootless as a result of all of these years of oppression and as a result of a society that deliberately made his color a stigma and something worthless and degrading.
Mm. A- As someone who speaks for a living, I mean, just the oratory skills and the logical thinking and the metaphors that Dr. King used to explain his point, to advocate for his point is absolutely amazing. And you really see the reverend come out of him when he explains his points. Um but one thing that stood out to me in the last portion of that clip is how he says that American society was willing to give its white peasants land in the West, pushing out less West, giving its white peasants land, but it failed to do the same for its black peasants of African descent. I mean, wow. And then you come back and say, well, black people, why you can't pull yourself up by your bootstraps? Well, y'all didn't do it, but you have this expectation of us. Come on. Woo.
Yep. 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 That's exactly right. That is the reason why there's such a huge wealth gap today. It is not because we are lazy or inferior, don't want to work, none of that. It is because instead of getting a hand up, we got a boot in the seat of the pants. We didn't get all that those European immigrants received when they came here through Ellis Island government. And in another passage, Dr. King talks about how not only did they give them land, but they built universities to teach them how to uh, till the land, how to prosper from the land. And then not only that, he goes on to say, then the government also gave them billions in subsidies, even when they didn't have good crops. What did we get? Nothing. Nothing. And so that is the reason why in 2023 there is a wealth gap. That you can trace it back, and that's despite the fact that we laid the economic foundation for this country through the free labor that we gave this country for 2.5 centuries. Okay, so it gets emotional when you start really thinking about it. Um, but Dr. King, as you said, was so eloquent that he was able to harness God. God raised that man up, and put him in a good family first and foremost. I think to call his father Dad King, who was also a pastor. Good mother. She was assassinated, by the way. Um, and so he grew up in a good family, went to great schools, and the man was brilliant. He had a PhD before, I think he was about 25 years old when he earned his PhD. And so was able to, as you pointed out, to articulate precisely what African Americans felt. He could just use his intelligence, his brilliance, his words, his study, his scholarship to make it clear, to make it plain in words and parlance that the white power structure could understand and could not deny.
Yeah. And that lazy stereotype, that, I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. We
Yeah,
gave this country
the slaves,
exactly.
the lazy ones.
Well, about black people being lazy. We
That's
gave
what I'm
this
saying.
country
I mean, how they're saying the former slaves, the one who did the work of the lazy ones.
yeah, exactly. Us giving this country free labor, all of the contributions that we've made to this country in order for it to be a world superpower as it is today. Don't it's untrue, and don't call us lazy because we're not. Because America would not be America without the contributions of that forced um and unpaid labor.
I mean, who's lazy? The ones who have gone across the ocean to get other people to come back and work for them, right? I mean, it's pretty. It never made sense to me, even as a teenager, when I would hear that stereotype. I'm like, wait a minute. As a child, I'm like, well, we're the ones who did the work. So how is it that now we've become the lazy ones, stereotypically? It makes no sense at all. Um, so we have another clip from Dr. King, but Chloe, um, I'm kind of following you right now. I know you got some other quotes and other things.
Yes. I keep referring back to the speech, the other America, um, that he gave that is just so profound. So I want to read from there. He said, "It has failed to hear," meaning America. America has failed to hear that the plight of the Negro poor has worsened over the last 12 or 15 years. And he gave that speech in 1968. And we know that it's almost exactly the same as it is now. America has failed to hear that the promises of freedom and justice have not been met. Once again, in 2023, the promises of freedom and justice have not been met. He says, and America has failed to hear that large segments of white society are more concerned about tranquility and the status quo than about justice and humanity. Actually, in fact, today it's different. Now, large portions of white society are concerned about being anti woke and erasing and scrubbing America's history and the current systematic racism that still occurs. So it's actually worsened since Dr. King gave that speech in 1968, in my opinion, in terms of um, the failure to properly acknowledge the systemic racism and actually trying to reverse it and now have this anti woke movement.
In fact, large swaths, large segments of white society vehemently deny systemic racism. And we've all witnessed how they have, in certain states, have passed laws, have enacted laws so that children are not taught about the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow and systemic racism, because it may make white students uncomfortable. Um, Sister Ave says something I think is very important. She says, um, not only did they get free labor from our work, but they also took our inventions,
Mm.
patent them, and are reaping financial benefits to this very day.
Woo. Okay, Sister Ave. Yes. That's an even deeper and larger point that again goes into the economic gap between white and black Americans
The legal rebels are on top of it.
going
They
off.
our community is a very astute, very intelligent, well-read community, because they wouldn't show up here. I mean, we're for folks who want intelligent dialogue, who want thorough legal analysis, who want the, as you all say, who want the tea, right? Who want the tea, but
The
but
legal tea.
the legal tea, exactly, that hot piping legal tea, and that's what we do. That's what we do up in this space. That's what we do. And of course, my sweetheart, your mother, is in the house. She's in
Woo!
the house. She's in the house. She
Going
is up in
strong.
here, going strong always.
Speaking of mom, she sent some quotes that I want to send that are powerful from Dr. King's book.
Well,
Where do
let's
we go from
let's
here?
let's set that up, because one of
Okay.
the things that you, her, and I were discussing in the green room is, and it goes back to something you read a moment ago. So let's put that on the table and get some input from our listeners. You read how Dr. King said that there should be a wealth transfer,
Mhm,
right?
mhm.
And I told you how Joe the plumber led the attack on Obama and uh, basically called him a Marxist for talking about how the wealth should be spread around. Do you believe that Dr. King was a Marxist or even communist?
I believe that Dr. King was believed in communism, and I believe that Dr. King used communism to highlight how bad and how badly America's capitalistic society has failed.
So do you? So are you saying that you think he was a communist?
I'm saying I think he would, if it was a scale from communism to capitalism,
Hmm.
I think Dr. King would be more on the communism side based on
Really?
his speeches, based on what he said.
Okay. All right. So the fact that he talked about the fact that he talked about transferring some wealth from white America to black America for the work that they did, is that communism, or is that just economic justice or
I would say it's
Marxism?
not capitalism. It's not the free market and supply and demand and let the pieces fall as they may, um, which capitalism subscribes. I don't know if it is as far as communism, but I do think it is more of a socialistic term
Okay.
to try to even out the playing field for everyone, which is basically what socialism believes in.
And your mother strongly disagreed.
She
Um,
did.
yes, she she pointed out that um, Dr. King's enemies and naysayers, that's one of the ways they attack him, by calling him a communist, a Marxist. And that's the way they attack any, quote, woke, right? Any woke African American. He's a Marxist, he's a communist. But she strongly disagreed with that, and provided, like you said, some quotes from his book. Um, and I think the book is Where Do We Go From Here? Community or Chaos and Community. So, all right, now with that backdrop, go ahead with what she said because I have a quote here too.
Okay. Before we read that quote, I want to read from Dr. King's The Three Evils of Society, where he says, quote, um, this has driven many to feel that only Marxism has the revolutionary spirit. In a sense, communism is a judgment of our failure to make democracy real and to follow through on the revolutions that we initiated. So he's using communism as a backdrop to analyze the failures of democracy and of capitalism. What Mom provided from Dr. King's book, Where Do We Go From Here? It says, quote, the profit motive, when it is the sole basis of an economic system, encourages a cutthroat competition and selfless ambition that inspire men to be more I-centered than thou-centered. Equally, communism reduces men to a cog in the wheel of the state. The that in that will, quote, wither away
Chloe, you
when
froze up. You froze up. Go back and start reading from Equally.
equally communism reduces men to a cog in the wheel of the state. The communists may object, saying that in Marxian theory, the state is a, quote, interim reality that will, quote, wither away when the classless society emerges. True in theory, but it is also true that while the state lasts, it is an end in itself. Man is a means to that end. He has no inalienable rights. His only rights are derived from and conferred by the state. Under such a system, the fountain of freedom runs dry. So now he's critiquing Marxian theory. He goes on to say, restricted are man's liberty of press and assembly, his freedom to vote, and his freedom to listen and to read. Truth is found neither in traditional capitalism nor in classical communism. Each represents a partial truth. Capitalism fails to see the truth in collectivism. Communism fails to see the truth in individualism. Capitalism fails to realize that life is social. Communism fails to realize that life is personal. The good and just society is neither the thesis of capitalism nor the antithesis of communism, but a socially conscious democracy which reconciles the truths of individualism and collectivism. End
All right,
quote.
stop there. You got to stop there because um,
What are your thoughts on that, Dad?
well, we had this discussion, and I think Dr. King kind of settled it in this quote that your mom provided. Um, I actually think we're all on the same page. There were elements of communism, elements of Marxism, and elements of capitalism and democracy that Dr. King embraced. And I particularly love right here where he says, the good and just society. When he says that, I think of the scripture in the Bible, Psalm 89:14, that talks about God's kingdom being one of righteousness and justice. So God embraces both of those ideas, righteousness in society That's the good society that King is referencing, and justice, or the just society that King just talked about. And one of the things that white America does, especially this MAGA crowd, this conservative crowd, is they will label Marxism anything that attempts to bring about justice. If you make an argument for racial justice, then that's Marxism. If you make an argument for reparations, then they define that as Marxism. If you make an argument for the abolition of systemic racism, then you're a Marxist. You're a communist. Okay? They have done that over and over and over and over and over again. But for those of us whose point of reference is the Bible, and we know that God the Father is a God of both righteousness and justice, we don't play those games. We don't care if somebody says we're a Marxist when we are trying to achieve the goals that Jesus set out in Matthew chapter 25, verses 31 through 46, where he says, feed the poor, feed the hungry, clothe the naked, visit the imprisoned. I mean, that's what he said do. And on another occasion, he said, that he came to preach to the poor and to heal the brokenhearted and so on. So and then he also had, the Bible says so much about justice, so much that many white evangelicals don't want to hear about. So what they've done cleverly is they have taken a word like woke and are now saying, okay, anyone who advocates racial justice, anyone who talks about social justice, economic justice, healthcare justice, education justice, is woke in the pejorative sense, is Marxist in the pejorative sense. I mean, I just don't play those games. I know too much. It doesn't matter to me. So I love the way Dr. King just explained himself in this quote here. Basically saying there are elements of both systems that are needed. And when your point of reference is the Bible, then you transcend those labels that white America will try to put on you. If it's Marxism to do people right, to help people, to give people a helping hand, then call it whatever you want to call it. But then at the same time, society has to be a good society. It has to be a righteous society. And that's where hard work is concerned. That's where personal responsibility comes into play. We need both. And Dr. King embraced both.
Yeah. And I think more than anything, he was anti-poverty. That is the vein that he was getting into in the latter part of his life, with the speeches that we've been referring to, the three evils of society, the other America, um, even his speech against the Vietnam War, the last speech that he gave, I've seen the mountaintop. He was anti-poverty, and that is the direction that he was going to go. And from the quote that I read, it sounded like he was fed up with being put into a box. Look, don't just try to box me into capitalism, Marxism. I am for justice, and I am for anti-poverty, and I am for, um, you know, racial equality and all of that.
You're absolutely right about not wanting to be put in a box, because, the tail end of his life, after they had desegregated education, after they had won the Montgomery bus boycott, brought that city to its knees, desegregated public education, got the Civil Rights Bill passed, got the fair housing rights, voting rights, got all that done. Then he switched his attention to economic justice, anti-poverty, like you said. And that's really when he started really catching it, not only from white America, but from many in Black America who did not want him speaking out on issues of poverty, and of course, the white power structure definitely didn't want him speaking out against the Vietnam War. You know, so he became a vowed, hated person by by both sides, and that's usually what happens when you are a person who embraces, again, God's call for both righteousness and justice. You tend to catch it from both sides.
Yeah. And he certainly was catching it towards the end of his life from both sides. Um, so man, just to think what he would have done if he was not assassinated. I mean, I'm sure it would have been just as spectacular. I can't say the word.
Spectacular.
Yes, spectacular. Is what he was doing with racial injustice too.
Now, there's one more video I want to play, sort of set up here, and that is where he is asked by the NBC correspondent about African Americans in the North, okay? That is in the Northeast, because he had focused on the South. His battles had all been down in Alabama and Mississippi and Georgia and so on. Well, then he kind of switched his attention to the North, the northern slums, the Negro ghettos, as he called them. So there's a video that I want to play from that. So if we can, let's play that video. I think it's very insightful, Chloe.
Okay.
And again, this is for those folks in the North who oftentimes don't think that, who sort of see themselves as different from blacks in the South. It's like, well, we don't have that up here. We don't deal with that up. Well, just all you gotta do is just visit. Just go up to New York City and Philadelphia and Boston, and you'll see the hardcore segregation. You'll see the poverty. You'll see all the same issues that you see down south. Okay. Yep. All right, let's play this clip.
Is there something about nonviolence that made it, and I use that in the past tense, that made it more useful among Southern Negroes than the ghetto Negroes of the North?
I wouldn't say there's anything that makes it more useful to Southern Negroes. I think it is true that we've had more nonviolent movements in the South because the problem for many years was more crystallized and, in a sense, more visible in the South. We didn't have many civil rights activities on a massive scale in the North until 3 or 4 years ago. So I would say that we just haven't had a chance to experiment on a broad scale with nonviolence in the Northern ghetto. I have the feeling that nonviolence is as applicable and workable in the Northern ghetto as it is in the South. Now, there's a larger job there. The frustrations at points are much deeper. The bitterness is deeper. And I think that's because in the South we can see pockets of progress here and there. We've really made some strides that are very visible, and every Southern Negro knows that he can do things today that he couldn't do 4 or 5 years ago. Wherein in the North, the Negro sees only retrogress, and he doesn't find it as easy to get his vision centered on his target, the target of opposition, as he does in the South. Consequently, this is made for despair and at many points cynicism, a feeling that you can't win. And it simply means that we've got to develop in the North a massive job of organization and mobilizing forces and resources to deal with the problem in the urban ghettos of the North, just as we've done it in the South.
Well, in the South, particularly in Alabama, you had visible villains: Jim Clark, Bull Connor, cattle prods, police dogs. But in the North, you don't have those visible villains. Isn't it hard to get your people aroused and directed at something that isn't visible?
Well, that's exactly right, and this is what I was saying when I said it's harder to see a target. In the South, in the nonviolent movement, we were aided always, on the whole, by the brutality of our opponent. It isn't the same way in the North. The other thing is that you don't have legal segregation in the North as you do in the South. So it is much more difficult to get people to see exactly what you're doing, but it isn't an impossible job. It's a hard, it's a tedious job at times to get people to be aroused from their apathetic slumbers, but I still feel that Negroes in the North can be motivated just as they were motivated in the South. And I think as time goes on, with the growing economic deprivation in the Negro community, it will even be easier, because people will come to see that not only is something wrong in general, but something is wrong in particular in their own economic and housing situations.
Well, what is it? I mean, how do you find it? It's very subtle in the North, is it not?
It's subtle, but it's becoming much more visible. Anybody can see that the schools are more segregated in the North today than they were in 1954 when the Supreme Court rendered its decision declaring segregation unconstitutional. Anybody can look around the ghetto and see that ghetto schools are predominantly segregated and devoid of quality. Anyone who moves through a major ghetto of our country will see the housing conditions. People don't have to be reminded that they are forced to live in slums in many instances, and they're often rat-infested, vermin-filled slums. And it isn't too hard to see the exploitation that the Negro confronts in the ghetto, where he is forced to pay more for less and constantly trying to make ends meet, but because of either no job as a result of unemployment or a job that is so economically unprofitable that the person can't make ends meet. And I think they see all of these things, and more they are coming to see them, because before, the people of the North were looking to the South, and they supported the struggles of the South. Now they are coming to see that their problems are very real, and they've got organized to grapple with them.
Was there something hypocritical about the fact that the South existed and the North could point the finger, and then when the Civil Rights Acts were passed in the early 60s, you couldn't point the finger anymore?
Well, there was no doubt about the hypocrisy of large segments of the nation on the whole question of racial equality. I think the best example is that many of the senators from the North and the West.
What a great dialogue there. A very
Yes.
good colloquy as he explained the racist issues that Black Northerners face. You know, in great cities like Philadelphia and New York, and I don't know if D.C. is considered north, but it's north of the southern states, and you know, Delaware, and you know, places, Boston, places like that. Um, and they face the same types of issues. You know, if you live in New York City right now, for example, you know, a 1-bedroom apartment, $2,500, $3,000.
Mm.
I don't understand how working people are able to pay that. And then if you throw racism on top of that, you know, there are a lot of Black people in those northern cities who catch a lot of you know what, a lot of it. Okay. So, And then this was in 1968, I believe, when he gave this interview. It was like 10, 11 months before his assassination. So I think it was in 68. Well, it would have been 67 if it was 10 months before his assassination, because unfortunately, I remember his assassination date because my son's birthday is on the day that he was assassinated. Caleb was born April 4th, 1994. And he was assassinated April 4th, 1968. Dr. King was. So 10 months prior to that would have been in 67. And what Dr. King did not know and did not live to see was the blatant, hateful racism that cities like Boston showed when busing started, when they actually started implementing Brown versus Board of Education. Oh, wow. The racism came out in as much of a violent and virulent way as we saw down south. They were determined, like Arkansas, like the whites in Arkansas, Jerry Jones, were determined to not see blacks come to their school and integrate at their schools, up in the North, that is. So he didn't see that. He didn't live to see that, but it was just as bad there.
Yeah. And it's still like that to this day. Even to this day, the North is has some of the most segregated cities in this country, and the Midwest, and the West as well. I visited Milwaukee about a month or so ago, and before I went there, my friend told me how segregated Milwaukee is. And I did a little bit of research, and Milwaukee was named by some publications as one of the worst. No, not as one of, as the worst city
The
for,
worst. Yeah.
yeah, for Black Americans in this country. Um, and she sees it for herself firsthand, the segregation, how the lack of power that Black residents have, um, the inequality. And she says that what the Midwest does, or at least what Wisconsin does, is they'll give a lot of government aid, but then they won't let Black people actually have power or participate in voting, in politics, in going into wealthy neighborhoods, etc. So it's not just the South, basically.
That's right. And he actually moved so by the time he did this interview, Dr. King was living in Chicago at this time. Him and his wife, the late, great Coretta Scott King, relocated to Chicago and founded Operation Breadbasket, which became Operation Push, which later became Rainbow Push, which Reverend Jesse Jackson Sr. has been running for the last, 50 years. So yeah, he was really focusing his attention in his later years on economic equality. Um,
Yep.
he led the sanitation. That's why he was in Memphis when he got killed. He was there to lead the sanitation workers march, where they they basically had no rights. They were doing a very, very dirty job, and the way they were being treated by the city, and not just Memphis but throughout, was horrible. And Dr. King was there to lead a meeting, and he was assassinated the next day. And their slogan, their battle cry, was simply, "I am a man. I am a man." And they were saying, "I have basic rights. I have basic rights as a man. I have the right." You said in the Declaration of Independence, I have the same rights as everybody else. So if I work hard, I should make enough. I should make a living wage. if I work hard, and I saw that with my father. My father worked all his life. I had to make him stop working. Um, he'd leave the house at 4:30 in the morning and get back home late in the evening, doing outside laborious work. I saw that with your mother's father, uh, Mr. Battle. These men did these back-breaking jobs to take care of their families, which was also another reason why I never understood where this whole lazy tag came from. Um, all the men that I grew up around worked like crazy. I mean, they worked like crazy. My father worked in concrete and cement all my life, and so did my wife's father, Mr. Battle. He worked in concrete and cement all his life, 30-some years, took care of his family, going to this job, both of these men. And so Dr. King began to tap into that frustration. Okay, we got the civil rights, we got the schools desegregated. Your kids can go to white schools to try to get an equal education. We're working against all the voter disenfranchisement, the Fair Housing Act. That didn't come about. Your mom reminded me, didn't come about until after his death. But Dr. King said, okay, now let's go deeper into this thing and let's deal with the economic injustices that people face. And it wasn't long after that he was indeed assassinated.
And he talked about also the need for legislation. So he was a big proponent of the movement and the movement out on the streets, but he talked a lot about getting legislation to add teeth to the movement. In one of his speeches, The Other America, he said in 1875, the nation passed a civil rights bill and refused to enforce it. In 1964, the nation passed a weaker civil rights bill. And even to this day, that bill has not been totally enforced in all of its dimensions. And actually, today, the Supreme Court, the way it's ruled, has weakened the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Bill even more from the time of even Dr. King. And he said that white politicians in suburbs talk eloquently against open housing, yet in the same breath contend that they are not racist. And in all of this and all of these things tell us that America has been backlashing on the whole question of basic constitutional and God given rights for Negroes and other disadvantaged groups for over 300 years. So he talked a lot about legislation, which then leads into voting and who is in office to write the legislation, to give teeth and to enforce our God given and constitutional rights. So that's why on this show, we always talk about why voting is so important and why who you have in office is so important. Because who you have in office in terms of the president, they're able to appoint Supreme Court justices that interpret the legislation that comes from Congress. You have Congress members who write legislation that can affect our lives. We talk a lot about the show about the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act that has passed the House but is sitting in the Senate because of what? Because of the politicians who are in office, who apparently are not for justice and policing. And then on the local level as well, on the state level, who we have in office in the state level, on the district level is important. So legislation is important, thereby voting is important, and getting out the vote so that we can have laws that will enforce the Constitution and the rights that we were given, and go from there. So he was a big proponent of that as well.
I want to show a photo. This "I Am a Man" campaign that Dr. King had tapped into. There it is.
Yep.
African American men just making a very basic, simple declaration. I am a man. I am a man. And you said in the Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal and are endowed by their creators with certain inalienable rights. So I wanted to give a pictorial of that. Chloe, as we come to a close, first we encourage everyone to spend this weekend commemorating and remembering and reading. And one of the first things I really strongly encourage everyone to read is Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail.
Mm.
I believe it is the most brilliant piece of literature I have ever read in my life, with the exception of the Bible. Okay, that's a whole different. I mean, the Bible's the Bible. That's the Word of God. I'm not putting it on that level. I'm talking about human inspired writings. Although somebody could make the argument that a letter from a Birmingham jail was inspired by the Lord, because Dr. King was definitely a prophet, no question about that. But yeah, that letter from a Birmingham jail, I mean, from all the books I read in my life, all the court cases, all the Supreme Court cases, all the articles, all that, nothing stands out to me like that letter. And to remember he wrote it in bits and pieces on scrap pieces of paper while he was actually in jail. And was given, parts of it to his assistant, I think attorney. So start there. Read that letter, and read everything else you can. Spend this weekend doing that, as well as Monday, because the man did a great thing. He made America a much better place, not just for African Americans, but for this country. And I want to ask you, Chloe, before we get out of here, young people are listening or will listen. What does Dr. King's legacy, and you did this early in the broadcast, for people who did not hear what you said early in the broadcast, what is the relevance of Dr. King's legacy, writings, ministry? What is the relevance to people in your generation, even younger?
At the core of what Dr. King taught is that your life is valuable and you deserve to be here. And because your life is valuable and because you deserve to be here, you deserve to be able to participate in the American dream, whether it be by going to school, getting an education, whether it be by going into the trades, whether it be by starting a business. Because your life has value in it, because you are someone, and you deserve freedom and to be able to live your life. That is what Dr. King talked about. That was the core of all of his messages. That is what was so profound about him. That there's a purpose for you and for your life. And by holding the government accountable, it is important to show that everyone in this country, really every human being, has a purpose. So for all of the young people who are listening who may learn about MLK in school or read his I Have a Dream speech, know that it goes beyond that. That his message was about lifting people up out of poverty and knowing that, if you go into the workforce, you should be treated equally as any of your other coworkers. That when you go to school, you should be treated as equally as any other student that you're going to school with. So he's not just some, kind of old school, old fashioned mythical figure from back in the day. But what he talked about is your life has value, still applies today. And that's what I take from whenever I read his speeches or his sermons, that we must stand up and realize that from within.
As we come to a close, let's go back to the illustration. What we're trying to achieve now is full equality. Chattel slavery was abolished, Jim Crow was dismantled, systemic racism, we're still dealing with it, and it stands in the way of African Americans having full equality. That is, African Americans having what Thomas Jefferson and the other signatories attested to in the Declaration of Independence: full equality as American citizens, just the way Chloe explained it. And the Pew Research Center did some research and found that African Americans, 63%, this kind of got distorted a little bit, I don't know what happened, but African Americans, 63% believe that racism is still a big issue for Black Americans. 60% believe that police brutality is a big issue for Black Americans. Again, please excuse, I don't know what happened when it came over to the PowerPoint, to Microsoft PowerPoint. 54% believe economic inequality is a big issue. 47% believes healthcare affordability is a big issue. Disenfranchisement, 46% believe is a big issue. 40% believe K through 12 is a big issue. Quite frankly, these numbers sadden me because racism is a huge issue in this country, systemic racism, and more than 63% of Black Americans should realize that. 60%, more than 60% should realize that police brutality is a huge, huge, huge issue. Black Americans are 10 to 14 times more likely to be killed by police officers. Economic inequality, huge, huge, huge issue. And more than 54% of African Americans should realize that. Healthcare affordability, voter disenfranchisement, only 46% believe. All the disenfranchisement that we see going on in these states, the voter suppression laws, the gerrymandering, all of this stuff that's going on to take away our vote, and only 46% of African Americans think it's a major issue. And I write about the issues in K through 12 education. It is horrible the way that public schools treat Black children. Horrible. So the issue is these issues are much bigger issues, and they affect African Americans a whole lot more than many African Americans realize. And that sense of indifference, we talked about that today, Chloe, before we got on the air. And, it just sort of saddens me a little bit. So we got a lot of work. That's why we spent almost 2 hours today, an hour and a half, going on 2 hours, talking about Dr. King and his legacy and all of these issues, because we are trying to get the word out. We're trying to get the word out across generations, not just my generation, but your generation and even younger than you, Chloe. And I think we did a pretty decent job. Some of the commenters, you all, Sister April said, I'm sorry, I'm having to look up so I can see my bifocals. Look, y'all, I'm over 60 now, okay? So excuse me. I remember growing up and seeing the old folk, looking like that. Because, your bifocals down here, you got to put it way up there so you can see. But thank God
I'm surprised you still have bifocals. I do associate that with older people.
well, look, I'm over 60 now, so uh still young, still healthy, but it is what it is. Um Sister April said, go to Northern California and you will run into some of the most racist people in the country. Thank you for that point, Sister April, because, um, yeah, I mean, I think the average person probably wouldn't even think California is racist at all, right? I mean, because, California is a so called liberal state, but there are pockets of California that are very, very racist. Very,
I.e. Kevin McCarthy, the new
i.e.
Speaker
Kevin
of the House.
McCarthy. Exactly. And and
Yep.
and way before McCarthy, i.e. Ronald Reagan.
True. Woo, true.
So good evening, Chloe and Mr. Corbett. Uh observing the facts greeted us, Chloe, and put some fire beside us. So it
Good
sounds
evening
like
back at you.
absolutely. Thank you for
Thank you for
tuning in
joining.
today. Yes, your mother said both are needed. I think good and just, or righteousness and justice. Absolutely, sweetheart. Thank you for producing in the background as always.
Yes.
So, yeah, we thank all of you for sitting with us today and listening and engaging in this conversation. Um, Let me put on the right music. I'm sorry. I had the wrong music on.
We hope that you all reflect on Dr. King's true legacy as we go into the Martin Luther King holiday on Monday. And don't fall for the okie doke. Don't let it be whitewashed. He was about radical justice, and we wanted to bring that out today. And we hope that you all will reflect on his legacy and figure out what you can do in your own communities to help us help America reach Dr. King's dream. So we can't wait next week. We got some more videos coming or topics. We will be talking about Andrew Tate. We did not want to taint our discussion of Dr. King with Andrew Tate foolishness that's going on, but we will be doing a legal analysis of everything that's happening with him. If you don't know him, you will find out in that next video. We'll have plenty of other topics. Thank you again for joining us today, and we will look forward to you all in the next video.
Peace. So